Nothing wrong with having fun. We're going to continue in our discussion on how to live a righteous life, how to live a holy life, how to live upright and survive in this crazy world that we live in. But we're not going to be in 1 Peter today. We're going to look at a couple of concepts that we throw around a lot, a couple of words that we use a lot. But we're going to define them maybe a little bit today. And we're going to do it with one of the parables in Matthew. You can turn over to Matthew chapter 20. We'll be there in a minute. But we'll talk about grace. How many times have you used the word grace in just your conversation? It's a word that we throw around a lot. There's another word that goes with it. It's a word mercy. But do we really know what those words mean? Do we really understand what it is when we talk about grace? When we talk about God's grace, when we talk about His mercy, when we talk about being gracious with others, when we talk about being graceful with others, when we talk about being merciful to others, what does that really mean? What does that really look like? So we're gonna use one of the parables today to kind of uncover that story and look at some other, maybe some examples to help us to understand. One of the previous Senate chaplains, maybe he said it pretty well when Edward Hale was the chaplain. Someone asked him one day, "Do you pray for the senators every day, Dr. Hale?" He said, I don't. I look at the senators and I pray for this country." I wonder if Chaplain Hale is still the chaplain of the Senate. But the reality is, it doesn't matter who it is. It doesn't matter if we're talking about political figures. It doesn't matter if we're talking about neighbors. It doesn't matter if we're talking about ourselves. Everyone needs God's grace. His grace is never ending. Never ends. There's an image. Jim, can you put that picture up there? It says grace never ends. It'll be there eventually. There's an image I want you to see. You ever been to the boardwalk in Atlantic City? That is a lot of wood. It is a long stretch. You ever driven down some highways, maybe in the desert in Arizona and New Mexico and those places where you just can't see the end of the road? Looks like it's never going to end. That picture of a boardwalk, that image, it just kind of goes up to the hill and we don't know where the end of it is. That's kind of like God's grace. It never ends. I don't care how unworthy you think you are. I don't care how bad we think we've done. God's grace never ends. We would be in trouble if it did, and I'm thankful for that. The former mayor of New York, maybe as an example of this grace, Mayor LaGuardia, LaGuardia Airport's named after him. When he was the mayor of New York City, he was the mayor during some of New York's worst days. He was the mayor during the end of the Great Depression. He was the mayor for all of World War II. And a lot of New Yorkers, they kind of referred to him as the little flower, because he was about this tall. He was 5'4". Did you just say amen? All right. And he always wore a carnation on his lapel. So they called him the little flower. Don't start wearing carnations. He was a pretty colorful character, though. He would ride around with the fire department. He would go out with the police and go help them do things. He would go to orphanages and take the entire orphanage to baseball games. He'd pay for it. He would, when the newspapers were on strike, which happened a lot during the war, he would take the comics, he would take the funny section, and he would read it out loud so that the children could still hear the funnies from the Sunday paper. He was a mayor that was about people. All kinds of people, all walks of people. And if you've ever been to New York City, you will run into all kinds of people from every race, from every nationality, from every creed, from every, you name it. You're probably going to run into them in New York City. But he loved people. He was all about doing for people. Well, one particularly cold January night in 1935, he showed up at the courthouse, and it was a courthouse that was in one of the poorest wards in town. It served the very underprivileged part of town. And he showed up one night, and his sole purpose in being there was to dismiss the judge so the judge could go home to his family. And he was going to sit on the bar for the judge for the remainder of the evening, just to take care of one of his officials. And so he did, and he's overlooking the things that are taking place. And within a few minutes, a kind of a haggard older woman, tattered clothes, and was obvious she was, not very well off, came and stood before him, and she was being charged with theft. She told the LaGuardia, she said, well, I have no money and I have no food at my home, and my daughter is sick and she can't provide, and my 2 grandchildren are hungry. So I went to the store and I stole 2 loaves of bread just so she could feed her kids, her grandkids. And she tried to plead with him, Your Honor, it's a really bad neighborhood, and I had to do what I had to do. Well, LaGuardia, being the man that he was, he showed some compassion, and he kind of took a deep breath, and he said, ma'am, what you've done is wrong. What you've done is against the law. You were a thief. You stole something that didn't belong to you. I have to punish you. The laws tell me that I have to punish you. And the punishment for what you did, there's no exception for. It's either a $10 fine or it's 10 days in jail. But even as he was telling her that, he was reaching into his pocket to get a $10 bill. 1935, in the middle of the Great Depression, $10 was a lot of money. That's a big fine. So the mayor took the $10 bill and he put it in his hat and he gave it to the bailiff, and he said, I am remitting your fine. And furthermore, I'm going to tell everyone in this room, bailiff, I want you to collect 50 cents from everyone that's in this room that lives in a town where a person has to steal bread so that their grandchildren can be fed. In the room was the red-faced store owner who was pretty upset about this. He gave 50 cents. In the room were many other petty thieves and people with traffic violations and several New York policemen. Each one of them had to give 50 cents, and they met it with quite a bit of applause, actually. At the end of the day, there was $47.50 that had been given that the mayor imposed as fines for the rest of the town. And he gave the woman $47.50 after paying her fine for being a thief. Now, was that justice for what she did? No. Absolutely not. What justice should have been would have been for her to pay the fine, or to have been for her to go to jail. How's she going to pay a fine when she has to steal bread to feed her kids? She sure isn't going to make any money while she's in jail for 10 days to pay that fine. Not to mention the kids are going to be hungry. No, what LaGuardia showed was grace. He provided for what she didn't deserve. And he didn't give her what she did deserve. Sure, there were a lot of people that didn't like it, but it was an example. It was a lesson for that lady. It was a lesson for the people in that courtroom that day. Might not have been fair to everybody else, but it was a perfect example of grace. You know, when Jesus died on the cross for you and me, he paid a debt that he didn't owe. It's still a debt that we owe, but it was so graciously paid for us on the cross at Calvary. And it wasn't just for us in this room. His grace is for everyone. You know, we're talking about living in a world that just doesn't seem fair. When I say everyone, I don't limit everyone to a certain ethnic group. I don't limit everyone to a certain group of people that look just like I do. Let's go redheads. I don't limit it to the underprivileged. I don't limit it to those that make 7 figures a year. I don't limit it to those that are oppressed. No, His grace is for those that are even threatening to end your life and my life. His grace is for those that are out stealing right now to provide for their children. His grace is for those right now that are out just looking to pick a fight because they don't like you. His grace is for everyone. You know what? If we're to live a Christ-like life, we have to show that grace too. Ouch. That ain't always easy. You think it's hard this week? Wait till we get to next week when we start talking about the laws of the land. And Peter tells us that it's our responsibility to obey the laws of the land and those that are appointed over us. Let's remember this grace lesson next week when we talk about that. If there was ever a day and a time that we were called to be graceful as the church, that the world needs to see that someone still loves it, 2015 looks like a pretty good place to start. Open with me to Matthew chapter 20 if you're not there yet. Jesus, I love the way he teaches in the parables. Have you ever done something or seen something and you just have to tell yourself, you know what, this is just not fair? That kind of happens every day. Some of those not fairs are really big not fairs. You've heard the phrase, good things happen to good people. Well, doesn't it just make you unbelievably mad when good things happen to bad people? How come they always seem to prosper? How come they always seem to get the good deal? How do you show them grace? How do you still exhibit grace when you feel like you've been let down? How do you still exhibit grace when you feel like the whole world is against you? This lesson, this parable is an unbelievable lesson in that. Read with me, starting in verse 1. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire men to work in his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius for a day and sent them into his vineyard. About the third hour, he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. He told them, "You also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. He went out again about the 6th hour and the 9th hour and did the same thing. About the 11th hour, he went out and found still others standing around. He asked them, "Why have you been standing here all day doing nothing?" "Because no one has hired us," they answered. He said to them, "You also go and work in my vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to the foreman, "Call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going on to the first." The workers who were hired about the 11th hour came and each received a denarius. So when those came and were hired the first, they expected to receive more. But each one of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. "These men who were hired last worked only about 1 hour," they said. "And you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the work and the heat all day long." But he answered one of them, "Friend, am I not being unfair to you? Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? So take your pay and go. I want to give the man who was hired last the same as I give you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous?" So the last will be first, and the first will be last. There's a whole lot going on in this story. There's a whole lot of anger. There's a whole lot of frustration. There's a whole lot of confusion going on in this story. But there's also a whole lot of justice in this story. Let's just start at the beginning. A day's work, what was considered a day's work in that day and time, would have been about 12 hours. No, I know there's some of us that work 12-hour shifts. I don't want to work a 12-hour shift. That makes for a really long day. I'd kind of be the guy that's at the end and just work an hour and get paid for a full day. That sounds like a pretty good job to me. But the reality is, and have you ever noticed that it seems like about, 20% of the people do 80% of the work? But who's the ones that get recognized? It's not always the 20%. It's not always the ones that do all of the work. And maybe the ones that came in at the end and helped move a chair, and they get the pat on the back. "What did you do? You picked up a chair. I've been here all day vacuuming the floors and cleaning and getting stuff set up, and I put all the tables out. You moved a chair," and they say, "Thank you to you." You ever been there? Gets a little frustrating, don't it? That's kind of where these guys are at. The landowner needed some people to work. So they would go to a place, and in that day it was pretty typical that common laborers would gather in a place waiting for someone to come along that needed employment or that needed someone to work for them, and they would just pick them. There was no, what are your abilities? What's your education? What's your degree in? What's your what kind of tools do you have? There was none of that. You were a general laborer, and you showed up, and someone would come along and say, "I need you to work for me today. How does a denarius for a full day's work sound?" Cool, we agree on a wage. Let's go to work. The landowner is expecting you to work for 12 hours that day, and he's going to pay you what he agreed to pay you. It was considered not good business practice to pay less than what the agreement was. He could pay more, but it's a bad thing to pay less. So you could expect he's at least going to take care of you in the way that he said he was going to. My, how things have changed. He agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and sent them into his vineyard. Well, as the day goes on, this is about 6 o'clock in the morning, is about, if we were to put it in our time, is about when the day would start. So as the day goes on, the landowner needs more help because he's got so much he's got to get done today that what he got to begin with is not going to cut it. So he goes back about the third hour, which would be about 9 o'clock in the morning, and gets more help. You notice it never says what his agreement is to pay them. He never offers them a certain amount. He says, I'll pay you what is right. It's not their choice on what's right. It's his choice. So he goes along again and says about the 9th hour, or about the 6th hour, which would be about noon. And then the 9th hour, which would be about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And then the 11th hour, which would be about 5 o'clock. That's about an hour before quitting time. He goes and he gets more help. Anybody that's ever worked production, you know that as the day starts, everything you may have lined up, it probably doesn't work quite like you expected because machines break, because people call in sick, because things happen. Order gets bigger than what it was supposed to be, and you need more help to get the job done. And maybe that's the kind of thing that was happening here. But the landowner never promised a day's wage to anybody except the ones at the beginning. He just told the rest of them, I'll pay you what's right. And to him, what was right is, I'm going to pay all of you a full day's wage, even if you only worked an hour. Can you imagine the frustrations? Can you imagine the anger when the guys that had been there since 6 o'clock in the morning saw that the first ones getting paid were the last ones that came to work? And when he paid them a full day, hey, they just worked an hour. We worked all day. I can't imagine what we're going to get. I'm not going to have to go show up in the work line tomorrow because he's fixing to pay me a lot of money. No, he just paid what he agreed them to pay, a day's wage. It's not their choice. It's theirs to accept, but it's not their choice on how much it is. It was not our choice for Jesus to go and die on a cross for us, but it's ours to accept. When he went to that cross, he didn't say, I'm going to the cross for those that are going to be born between this day and this day. He didn't say, I'm going to go to the cross for those that are just without. He didn't say, I'm going to go to the cross for those good old boys. No. It was his choice to go to the cross for everyone. It's everyone else's choice to accept that grace. When the argument had settled down and the landowner sort of made his point, listen, I haven't done you any wrong. I've paid you what we agreed on. You know, there's another lesson in this in the way that our society has got so selfish. We just want, we want, we want, we want, we want. We're not guaranteed anything. You think about it, the only thing that we're guaranteed is one of these days we're going to stand in judgment of a God that's created us. And the choices that we've made in life are the things that are going to be judged. We're not guaranteed anything between the here and then. Just like everyone else. It's God's grace that we accept that gets us through that judgment. Just like the landowner. I'm offering to pay you. It's your choice to accept it or not. Thank you for working for me. But where does mercy come in all this? Grace is being given what is not what we don't deserve. Grace is being offered, maybe by someone in authority to you, something that you don't deserve. What's the mercy side of it? Mercy is not being given what you do deserve. Every single one of us deserves an eternity in hell. Why? Because Paul tells us we were born sinners. It's up to us to accept the gift of grace that comes to eliminate the sin. When we accept the grace, we're given mercy to not have to deal with what we really are owed. Where's the mercy in this story? The landowner could have said, you want to argue about it? I'm not going to give you anything because I don't like your attitude. He had that right. He's the landowner. Do you realize that every day in our lives, we're extended grace and we're given mercy to not have to deal with the things that we do deserve? The question is, do we open our eyes and see it? Do we open our eyes and accept it? There's three things about grace that I want you to see in this story. And we'll try to do this quick. First of all, this parable tells us grace is received. It's not deserved. And that's for everyone, not just those that are chosen. Not just this race, not just that race. His grace is for everyone. For God so loved the world that whosoever believes in him, that whosoever means everybody that chooses to accept. I think that's a concept that our society is sorely lacking. Do you know, if we all could understand that God's grace is sufficient for all, there would be no racism. There would be no fights among people that we see fighting right now. Because everyone would realize I'm a nothing just like you are. And we're all sinners that if we accept it are saved by grace. That's a big concept to grasp. But if we're ever going to make a difference in the world, if we're ever going to even live in this world, it's a concept that we have to understand. God's grace is received. It's not deserved. Nothing we can do, nothing that we can do can put us in a position to deserve God's grace. It just can't. None of us are good enough. But God loved us enough that he made each of us worthy of it, simply because he loved us. There's a great example of grace, and any college students or recent college students, you can really appreciate this. You probably wish this guy had been your professor, but this one particular class, it was a tough class. And finals week had come upon the class, and you know how finals week gets. Everybody just starts cramming for the test and hoping you have all of your stuff turned in so that you can get all your papers graded, even if you only get 75% of the total grade now because it's late. You just hope you can get something so that you can pass the class, and you start to worry about all the exams. And why does it seem like every professor thinks they're the only professor on campus and they give you more work than you could possibly do, not to mention the other 4 or 5 classes that you're in? Yeah, some of you haven't been to college in a while. But this particular professor, when the class got in the classroom, the classroom was empty, their desks were empty, and the professor told them, hey, we're going to review real quick. We're going to take about 30 minutes to review for the test. So put your stuff away and let's go through this review. And as he went through the questions, they began to understand that most of the stuff that he was asking was from their study guide. But there was some stuff on there that they had never heard before. And the professor reminded them, you received a textbook at the beginning of the semester, and you're responsible for everything in that textbook, so anything in that textbook could be on the test. You can imagine the fears that started when they realized, oh my word, I haven't read the textbook, I just studied my class notes. We're in trouble. So the study session came to an end. The professor passed out the test and laid them on their desks upside down, said, do not turn your test over until I give you the final directions. So as it came down to time to take the test, the professor said, you're going to have an hour to take this test. You can turn your papers over and you can begin. And to everybody's amazement, as they turned their papers over, they started to notice that every single answer was already answered, or every single question was already answered. Even the essays already had an essay written. And when you got to the very end of the test, as people started flipping through the test kind of in disbelief that everything's been answered, they get to the end of the test, and underneath the last question, it makes the statement, your test has been filled out by your professor. You have just experienced grace. It was a theology class that the discussion of grace and mercy had got pretty heated, and some of them just didn't get it. So the professor took the opportunity to tell them, I wouldn't do this normally, but this was the best way I could explain to you what grace is. And then we began to go around the room and ask the students, did you deserve the grade that you got? Did you deserve the grade that you got? Do you deserve the A on this test? Did you study enough to get this A? Do you really deserve this grade? And the class began to understand, oh my goodness, none of us are worthy of what just happened to us, but this is what grace is. None of us are worthy of what Jesus did for us, but that's what grace is. Grace is given freely, and it's given to everyone who will openly accept it. Do we mirror that in the way that we deal with people? Do we offer that same grace to people? Do we offer that same forgiveness to people that have hurt us? I hope so, because that's being Christ-like. And there is no way this world is going to survive without people actually being Christ-like. You may need to receive that grace of His today. I don't know. We'll talk about that later. So grace is received. It's not deserved. The second thing is this. Grace is about mercy. It's not about fairness. If it was about fairness, the guys that showed up in the 11th hour would have been paid an hour's worth of work, not a full day's worth of work. If it was about fairness, the guys that showed up in the middle of the day would have been paid half a denarius and not a full denarius. Or you could say it this way, if it was about fairness, the guys that showed up in the last hour and were paid the full day's wage, the ones that worked the whole day would be paid 12 times that. But fairness wasn't to be decided by those that were working. Fairness was to be decided by the landowner. Life is just not fair, period. But that fairness is not to be decided by us. But the grace that can get us through that is for all. Amen. Thank you, Jesus. Anybody know who Larry Burkett is? He's a Christian speaker. He's big in the area of personal finance. Him and Dave Ramsey are two of the big names that you hear. Well, Larry Burkett wrote a book called Business by the Book. And it's about going the extra mile in business. It's about taking care of the people that work for you. It's about like doing what this landowner did. Letting people know that you appreciate them. And in this book, he tells the story of a time early in his career where he had leased an office building. And the building that that he leased, it proved to be quite a nightmare. Some of you may have read this book and know this story. But he talks about the building. He says the very foundation that the building was built on was not constructed properly. And in the time that he was there, the office was literally sinking. The building was literally sinking into the foundation. Over the course of a year, it would sink a couple of inches. That's pretty significant. I mean, even in Arkansas, where you can't find a foundation that the concrete won't crack, sinking a couple inches in a year is a big deal. And after more than 3 years of putting up with all kinds of problems, which included power failures from meters being pulled off the wall due to walls sinking and all kinds of crazy stuff like that, he finally decided to move his business. Spent several weeks without water. It was just a mess. Always having to repaint the walls because they were cracking. And he just decided this is enough. So he moved out. And a couple of months after he moved out, he received a letter from the guy that owned the building, from his former landlord. And his landlord was demanding that Burkett pay for all of the damages from the previous 3 years for the building, even though none of it was his fault. It was justified that none of it was his fault. Burkett even hired lawyers that did research and saw all of the documents for the work that had taken place and went back to even when the building was built and pulled the permits and saw the problems that the building had. His lawyers even said, "You're not responsible for this. This is not your fault. I can't believe that you put up with it this long. You don't owe that guy anything, so just forget all of this." Well, Larry was reminded by his son, "Dad, you just wrote a book about going the extra mile. You just wrote a book about being merciful in the business place. You just wrote a book about showing grace to those that don't deserve it. You just wrote a book about taking care of people. How are you going to handle this situation, Dad?" So Larry decided to show some mercy to the landowner. And he told him, he said, "Listen, I get it. The lawyers have this documented that none of this is my fault. I don't owe you anything. But I'm going to pay to have your building fixed. Because you need a place that you can attract someone to rent your building. You don't need to be without rent in this building for however long, because that's going to hurt you financially. And that's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in your well-being. So I'm going to commit several $1,000s to you to fix this building. That's mercy. That's not giving what is deserved and providing what's not deserved. That's God's grace. His grace is merciful. Are we merciful to those that have done us wrong when it's time to forgive them? I hope so, because there's going to be those times that we seek forgiveness from others. And we sure hope that they're going to be merciful to us. That's being Christ-like. So God's grace is received, it's not deserved. His grace is about mercy, not about fairness. And last of all, God's grace is for the last as well as it is for the first. His grace is for the least of these as well as it is for the most well-off of these. His grace is for everyone. Can you imagine? It's hard to imagine. Some of the people that we see in the news, the Muslim extremists, those that are so wrapped up in liberal agendas that they create hatred. It's hard to imagine that God's grace is for them too. But it is. It's hard to imagine that God would ever want them to be part of His kingdom. But He does. It's hard to imagine that we could ever forgive someone that has done us wrong. But we can. And we can do it through God's grace and through His mercy. There's a story that I think I'm going to end this with that probably illustrates this very well. There's a woman that had grown to adulthood. And in her childhood days, her dad had abused her pretty significantly. And as she grew up, she overcame the emotional damage that had been done by the things that her dad had done. And she became a Christian, and she eventually got married. And now years later, she has her own children. And she's raising her own family, and her children are fully grown now. And one day she received a letter from her dad. Hadn't heard from him in years. Received a letter from her dad. And the letter told her that he had become a Christian and had asked God for forgiveness. And he realized that in order for him to be willing or be able to accept the forgiveness that God gave him, he needed to ask his daughter for forgiveness. She wasn't expecting that letter. She also wasn't expecting the emotions that came from reading that letter and the feelings that she apparently had been harboring, but she didn't know. And she thought to herself, how can this man that's done these wrongs to me possibly be a Christian like I am? I've not done anything wrong. I've been the good one. He's been the bad one. It's not fair that he can receive the same grace and the same mercy. That's an honest feeling. That's an easy feeling to have. That's an easy way to look at people that have done us wrong. It's an easy way to look at things when we just feel like we're not being treated fairly. Is there's no way that he can be just as right as I am. Maybe it's possible that I can be just as wrong as he was. All depends on your perspective. So she knew this was not going to be an easy thing to do. She was mad. She was hurt. She was angry. She didn't want to have anything to do with it. She was mad about the fact that him even contacting her had brought up feelings that she hadn't felt in a long time. And could not conceive how a God that she thought allowed those things to happen could possibly forgive him. And then one night she had a dream. And in this dream, she saw her father standing on an empty stage. And above him appeared the hands of God holding a white robe. And he placed the robe on her dad as he asked for forgiveness. And as she's looking at this scene, she started to realize that that's the same white robe I'm wearing. And she started to realize that in God's eyes, he really is no different than she is. That in God's eyes, he can be forgiven and can be a born-again sinner, just like she was. And it's in that moment that she understood God's mercy. It's in that moment that she understood that this man that for years she thought was the scum of the earth, that she thought was the last, in God's eyes, he had made him the first. Isn't that the way it's supposed to be? When another one comes to that understanding grace of who God is in their life, we should gladly put them to the front of the line and say, welcome. Welcome aboard. That's what he means when he says the last will be first and the first will be last. It's easy to look at ourselves as being first because I'm a Christian. It's easy to look at myself as being first because I do all the Christian stuff. Because I go to church and I read my Bible and I sing songs and I do this and I do that. You know, in God's eyes, all of us are sinners saved by grace. Every single person that walks by the neighborhood, every single person you see on the news picking up a gun and martyring a Christian is just a sinner that hopefully will be saved by grace. It's painful to say, but I would love to see one of those ISIS brothers be put at the front of the line because he's accepted Christ and the forgiveness that comes through his Son on Calvary. Do you know the place we would live if that were to happen? You know the world we would live in if we could just understand what grace really is and what mercy really is? God's grace is a free gift that we receive, not what we deserve. It's a gift that's about mercy. It's not about fairness. It's not about who's worked the longest. It's not about who's owed the most. It's about mercy. And it's a gift that's for the last as well as it is for the first. Matter of fact, it's a gift that makes the last first. It makes us all the same in God's eyes. You know, there's story after story after story in the Bible of those that we wouldn't pay a bit of attention to before they had an encounter with Christ that went on to be some powerful, powerful witnesses for him. There's a little bitty video I want you to watch before we close this morning that sort of makes that point. Maybe an understanding of what grace and what mercy is. Play that video, Jim. God's the God of the broken. You ever thought of it that way? You see, we're the workers that showed up in the morning looking for a job. God's the landowner that provided the wage. And that day's pay is that eternal reward that we've been talking about. None are too late to get that reward. None are not worthy of that reward. There's not one that's not worthy of our forgiveness. There's not one that's not worthy of our grace and our mercy. We live in a world that's trying to push him out. We live in a world that's decided it can do it on its own. We live in a world that's making it very clear it has no interest in him. The only way to forgiveness is through his grace. The only way to restoration is through the God of brokenness. Do you know who the three people that the video was talking about was? The first one was the criminal that was on the cross next to him, that just in the minutes before he died asked him for forgiveness. And he told him right then, you'll be in paradise with me today. He didn't have time to go do all the church stuff. Is that fair? That's grace. Do you know who the second one was? Do you know who the terrorist was that was sent out to kill Christians? It was Paul. You thought they were talking about somebody today, because they exist today. That was Paul. He was on a mission to go and kill Christians. When God struck him on the road to Damascus and got his attention, Paul didn't deserve the life that he continued to lead. That's mercy. God showed him that on the road. You know who the third one is? It's the adulterous woman that had the many husbands. Oh, sure, Jesus called her out. She admitted to her faults, and Jesus said, you're right, you're a sinner. But there's not one in here that's a less sinner than you that's worthy of picking up the first stone and throwing it. And if you are, go for it. He called everybody else out too, because they're all just sinners waiting to be saved by grace. If we could look at the world that way, if we could look at our neighborhoods that way, not as sinners, but as the broken that need God's grace, maybe that just might change the way we look at the world. Maybe that just might change the way we look at people. So we can't live in this world the way Peter calls us to live unless we understand that it's only through God's grace that we're forgiven. It's only through his mercy that we don't have to suffer. Why can't we show it to others? Stand with me this morning.